Hello and welcome to the first episode of the second year really, of AS for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I start this year's conversations with Dr. Torange Khonsari, course lead on the Design for Cultural Commons at London Metropolitan University and co-founder and director of London-based art, architecture and urbanism practice Public Works, whose outputs include the Ministry of Common Land Room in the British Pavilion at the 2020-21 Venice Biennale. We talk about the commons thinking, and cultural commoning practices, and the role of architecture in their or its production and sustaining presence in the urban realm.
So if you start to see that within that context, and then what it is that you're producing, what are the values and meanings that they construct and create by you putting that stuff in the world, I think that's what I'm ultimately interested in. And in that sense, it can be spatial, it can be object-based.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Torange Khonsari. Dr. Torange, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi there. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really honored to be here. So I'm Torange Khonsari and I am the founding director of Public Works, which is a kind of crossover public art, architecture, and urbanism, if you like, with a lot of influence from political activism, in the softest probably version, and a lot of kind of social sciences theoretical ideas that are embedded within it as well. I also designed the course Design for Cultural Commons, which is again interdisciplinary at London Metropolitan University after teaching architecture for 20 years. Which I felt that the impact I could have would be in a broader kind of disciplinary context than just in architecture. So that's me.
So you teach that course is not just limited to the architecture school. That's geography students and sociology students.
It has. So far I've had graphic design students, fashion students, artists, architects, people doing journalism, so it's completely, and that's what was really important, activists, that's what's been really important about it, because you start to influence a much wider sphere with commons thinking than just one discipline. And it was also, the commons was also an interest because I felt that the disciplinary enclosures that, the 19th century kind of started to put in place was quite limiting. And, I think we're a bit stuck due to disciplinary enclosures. We keep reproducing the same things.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a very good way of putting it. The disciplinary enclosures is a lovely phrase. I want to come obviously onto commons thinking. So as we were talking about before we started recording, I came across your profile on LinkedIn, and I'm not being sponsored by LinkedIn, by the way, but I feel it's only polite to mention them. And yeah, really fascinated by this idea of commons thinking. So I want to get onto that, but I would like to understand this course a little bit better. So so you're an architect, you were trained as an architect. So how does an architect run an interdisciplinary course? What does that actually look like in practice? Because I think that's kind of mysterious.
Yeah. So I taught architecture and trained as an architect, but I suppose my practice life, the 50% of my practice life was always in between, across. So I worked with performance artists, and I worked with public art, public artists. We were in the art context and in the art world, And then, I even worked with colleagues who were in oral history and heritage and community engagement in different spheres. So what the practice did was just really open up a kind of how does spatial practice in a way apply to lots of different environments, still within the city, still within the context of neighborhoods. But actually, I started to look at our skill set as architects as wider than just building buildings, which I found really problematic. As a kind of, I just thought we have much more skills that architecture education gives us than just building buildings. And that's why I had a real problem with continuing to teach in architecture. So how that looks like, it's very student-led. So it's more like a laboratory than actually a course, because the Commons is quite a new kind of discourse, really, in its new form. Of course, it's a very historic and ancient concept, but in its new concept, which kind of really kind of got catapulted by Elinor Ostrom in 2008, it's relatively new. So that meant that I, of course, deliver lectures, not just around the Commons, but around critical thinking, around objects, things, aesthetic, which that borrows from philosophy, politics, sociology, cultural studies, all sorts of areas. But then it's driven by the students' practices. So they're the experts. They come in as the experts within their field. So you do have to have certain maturity. It's more a professional course. It's definitely older people who are on there, kind of late 20s upwards. It is also a feeder into the PhD program that I run on the Commons. But as a course, you do kind of one module which is theoretical around what are common goods as things that we produce. Because at the moment we produce for the market, private goods, and we produce possibly in limited amount for the state as public goods. But the common goods are completely underdeveloped. They either get co-opted, and the common good are the kinds of goods. So if you say the commons is the realm of community and citizens, so it's more ground up. So it's this other sphere, which is always kind of either co-opted, or it's kind of this funny thing that you volunteer in. It's not where you actually, I mean, of course, there are people who get paid to be within that sphere, but it's kind of weirdly called the third sector, or, and that doesn't mean much, because they've become like housing associations, both kind of run with the bureaucracy of the state, but for the markets, so actually I don't know what the hell they are. So in a way, I think that kind of clarity of a common sphere is really, really important, and we need to design for it. So one is about the common goods. The other one is about the form of organization or practice. So what are the services that you provide? And it's a lot of, I think I've realized that I'm quite entrepreneurial in the way I think. So I then support the students to be quite entrepreneurial in terms of what is that practice. And then there is the project module, which is the Commons project that you develop with Commons principles, with what is the production method, what are the raw materials with which you're creating something? What are the services? How do you produce? Where do you produce? How does it get exchanged in terms of, is it based on cost and pricing, or is it reciprocal, or what is it? What are the forms of exchange? And then what is their impact? What are they impacting? So it's really quite rigorous in terms of really, really thinking about what it is that you're producing, rather than this kind of rather ancient kind of idea of, disciplinary ideas of what you produce as a practitioner in a world that, we have, as we are today, sitting at it on a day that we have a heat wave, we have climate crisis, we have social inequalities to levels that are quite detrimental, and so on and so forth. We can't.
Profoundly detrimental. You're allowed to say it. I think it's. I was thinking about this yesterday, but that sounds absolutely fascinating. So there's a big component of. I hadn't planned on talking about this course, but I think it's really sounds really interesting, really important actually, because I mean this idea of teaching methodological engagement.
Yeah.
Is that part of it? Is there a substantial part about how?
Yeah.
I remember talking to a young architect, and they had got a job working for a research group, and one of their jobs was to go and speak to poor people.
Yeah.
And they said to me, I kid you not, how do you speak to them?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what have we done?
Yeah.
That we've created, because this idea of this consolidating disciplinary thing is it's not getting better.
No. And I think
like contemporary architecture is like the contemporary architect. I was talking to Al Parvin the week before last on the podcast. We're actually getting worse at this.
Yeah.
Like, it's bizarre.
Yeah, because it's a lot of lip service. It's also, it is, what has taken public works, what's taken us so long, and it has created a specialization for us, is how you talk to the people. Because it's not enough to go into an already active community and then you produce something for them, because you still have that relationship of client architect relationship. That's fine. I mean, nice for you, but it's really not that radical, and it isn't really helping that much. But to actually, and I've been doing this stuff since the late 90s. So the amount of time architects have said to me, are you a social worker then? And again, it's that enclosure of and I think they do it because they don't understand. It's unfamiliar territory. And the psychology of familiarity is that you always have to turn something into something familiar in order to engage with it. And they couldn't engage with it because we weren't really teaching it. And so the nitty-gritty bit of how you actually engage with people, how you actually talk to people, I couldn't teach it. Because it takes so long. And by the time the students become really good at it, they have to design a bloody building, and then the building is really inappropriate. So you could do it if it's 2 years. So but then you have this ridiculous thing in an architecture, this kind of convention or myth that, you shouldn't have the same student, in postgraduate twice or two, and then you think, well, where did that come from? In a way, who said that? I mean, by that time, I understand it at undergrad, I understand that, but at postgrad, you would think that they're actually specializing. So if they're specializing in social kind of context, they do have to spend a year, doing that stuff. So I think there are these doctrines and are very, very problematic. And I think we do have to unpick them.
And that's what your course does. That sounds fantastic. Yeah. Great. We've gone off piste immediately, so that's about normal. But that's. But I think it's a good setup for what the broader stuff. So you sent me sections of your doctoral thesis, which is much nicer than mine, by the way. Really nicely written, and you sent me three chapters of it, and I wanted, so I read through it in a generous way, not like not like a viva voce, I can tell you.
And I wanted to start off with this idea. So we're using these words, commons thinking. You've mentioned Eleanor Ostrom. Obviously, as you said, it goes back to pre-Ostrom, to Garrett Hardin, and to even before that to Hobbes and Thomas Hobbes and so on and so forth. And I thought maybe it would be really wonderful to get your sort of you to kind of unpack what you mean defining commons and their value specifically in relation to design, because you've touched on this, and this was an area I think it's probably a podcast discussion in its own right, which is, what do you mean by design? So we won't go there, because that's probably a thesis in its own right. So I just wanted to, if you could define this commons and commons thinking and its relationship to architecture.
Yeah. So as I said, as you might have gathered by now, I kind of have an issue with disciplinary enclosures and the doctrines that they invoke. So the thing is that you do need communities of practice, and you need these communities of practice in order to feel part of a community and have an autonomy and so on and so forth. So I suppose that's the bit around the disciplinary that I really enjoy. What I don't enjoy is when those boundaries become impermeable, and when those boundaries become protected so much that they kind of start to not allow so much fluidity. So they're not thresholds anymore, they're borders, And so the commons, what was interesting, and whenever people say, so what do you do, I was always like, oh well, I do something between art and arc. And so it just became this kind of difficult thing to describe. And then when I was thinking about the commons, when I was thinking about how do these things come together in terms of our practice, the commons became really, really interesting, because in their core, they are about relationships, and especially social relationships. So the bricks and mortar, if you like, of the commons are relationships. That's what our practice was about. And so it felt like authentically, that's where the home of bringing these different disciplinary discourses together would be. So you can just then say, I'm a commons practitioner, And then, of course, there's what is a commons practitioner until it becomes kind of something that people understand. But it at least sat within a historical discourse, And so that's what was really interesting for me. That's why I started it. And as I was reading all the books, as I was doing the literature, I kept thinking I was getting more and more confused about what the commons were, because nobody kind of started to say, this is what it is, which is not what I'm saying should happen. But I felt like I had to get a handle for myself what I think it is within what I do in order to be able to then innovate within it. So then there was a eureka moment when I was reading Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, where she has this 21st century priority list with earth at the top and power at the bottom. And in the middle, I just redid the diagram. So she has it as a list, so you don't really see the hierarchies, but I did a visual diagram of it. And then realized that in the middle, right in the middle, was the public, the state, the commons, the community, and the markets, the private. I mean, the household we don't anyway deal with as the private because of liberalism and neoliberal thinking. So let's take that away from the private for a moment. So then it's the market. And so I suddenly thought, this is like the institutional fulcrum almost in this middle that kind of should work together. It's not about one having hegemony over the other, but actually should work together within their own logic to actually have a much more stable ecosystem. So you do need the public, and that but it has a very different logic. It is for the crowd, it is the many. It is open in its boundary. You know, it has a very specific logic and culture. The private is enclosed. It is about commercial. It is, we know what the market is. And then the commons just gets pulled either as social enterprise into the other, or as citizenship and community organizations into the public. But it as its own sphere, with its own institutions, its own economic model, its own practices, its own goods, and so on, it hasn't really been developed. And volunteering is not enough for it. It's a place I want to labor. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a place I want to work. I don't want to just volunteer in it, you know. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I think it's really, for me, it was just really good to start to see it as another sphere, which is bottom up. It's you know, it has a boundary that is negotiated and a threshold between, you know, the other two. Its organization and governance needs to be designed. And actually, it's very system design orientated. You know, mm-hmm. it's a lot of design that has to go into it, but it starts to completely shift the way we think, in a way. It has a lot of feminist discourse within it. It was the arena that women kind of occupied to have a voice outside the home, you know, and so on and so forth. So I just found it really exciting, as a sphere. So I would say it's a sphere where I probably would like to spend the rest bit of my time teaching in, working in, and labouring for.
But the commons itself traditionally is defined as a kind of a shared resource.
Yeah.
And these days, say for example, in relation, so in Marx's descriptions of and William Cobbett's descriptions on rural rides of pre-Reformation Britain, the commons is the shared land, which is a shared resource that's controlled, as you say. Interestingly, it's a very defined thing. It is a literal space.
Yeah.
And it has a series of rules about how you occupy and use it, who can or who can't. And as you again, as you say, it has this quality of it's an emancipatory space.
Yeah.
And it gets taken over at the time of the Reformation, according to Marx, transferred into land, sheep runs, as he calls it, for the landed gentry to produce wool.
Yeah.
And gets corrupted. And then Garrett Hardin goes on, and Garrett Hardin in the 60s goes on to talk about the tragedy of the commons, where you have these common resources, and because of self-interest, so Garrett Hardin is a sort of tub thumper, or perhaps a bellwether for capitalism.
Yeah.
Suggests that any common resource gets consumed by self-interest.
Yeah.
Ostrom comes along and talks about the joy of the commons and the possibilities of it. But we've got this idea now as well, haven't we, of commons being things that are more ephemeral, so less spatial. This idea, for example, that you've touched on, the idea of common resource being the air we breathe, or the social networks we occupy in digital space.
Yeah.
And these are not defined, are they? And this is where you're talking about how we need to define boundaries so that we can kind of work within it.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's, again, as a system. So you're absolutely right. I think there are common resources, but what those common resources are part of the design process of the project. And I will give you an example in a minute, just to kind of illustrate that. But I suppose Ostrom was challenging Hardin, saying it's about the governing system of the commons. It's not that they don't work. It means that they need to have principles and law regulations and so on. And it's then who makes those regulations, how you make it. And that's why you have to be defined in a smaller group, because then in order to have it democratically, you know, if you become too big, then you get the usual thing of the more empowered voices get heard, and so on and so forth. So the whole thing it needs to be designed. However, the resources, it depends what those resources are. And so, for example, if we say, so really kind of simple idea. So you design a temporary building, for example, in an empty space, and this is based on one of the projects in the PhD. So you have that, and then and those resources have been paid for. I mean, at that point, it was paid for by the state, for us to build this temporary space in Bow. Then, when we were taking it down, and so, sorry, just going back. So this temporary space then becomes a tactical, temporary piece of architecture for us to demonstrate social and cultural value within that site. So what you start to do is you start to change the value system of that piece of land. It isn't just about it being economic. It starts to be about other things as well, other forms of capital, if you like. So the architecture, the temporary architecture as a common good has agency. And it becomes something that has agency within the sphere of the commons, because it is part of the production of that community and the commons within that neighborhood, right? So then you say, okay, well, now I have this. Then we did this feasibility study, and we had all these reports, which were really, how architects do reports, which are usually kind of top down. But we did the reports, which was really about the documentation of this new value system. And so the feasibility study suddenly, in a very subtle way, shifts. It systemically shifts that it is quite activist in a way. It has agency again. And then we went with that to Clarion Housing Association and said, we would like this piece of land to have a permanent building on it for the community to run it. And because they have a public agenda as a housing association, then they cannot just ignore that, right? Because it's not just within their interest is not purely in the commercial sphere. So then we managed to do that. We're still in the process of getting the 20-year lease signed, but we had the head of terms, whatever it is, and then we crowdfunded through the GLA and kind of raised the funds to build this permanent building. Now, what happened to those components as we demolished that building, the temporary structure? Part of it went to a local community garden to do beehives, to make a new beehive. Part of it went to a local adventure playground. So the system within which those materials circulated, again, is within a system of commons, within that kind of structure. And so it's not that we're not doing this stuff. We're just not articulating it within a kind of discourse, which is one that we're all behind. Everybody just names something else to claim it, and then we just become more and more disparate rather than autonomous. So the real issue that I struggled with is now, the building is a flat pack, but that comes. I didn't manage to look at how you do that in a permanent way, because our budget was so tight that anything I could do just to create this building was going to be a miracle, and I won't go into why that was, but that is a whole book. I don't want to be public about it, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But I think
sounds like a trauma.
Yeah, it was a bit, but I think that bit still needs quite a bit of work in terms of how, and that's a tricky bit, bit, because we are hitting against risk assessments, against quality measures around all sorts of bureaucratic institutional stuff the moment it becomes permanent.
That's really amazing. So the building itself is a mechanism.
Yeah.
No. The intervention is a mechanism for consolidating and enhancing cultural capital. And we'll get onto this idea of cultural commoning that you've talked to, that I wanted to talk to you about as well. So the building is not in itself the thing of value, it's the thing that the building enables or procures, which is the social and cultural commons, which is a beautiful idea. And I actually think, so coming back to this idea of disciplinary enclosure, the word enclosure, I think, is really important here, doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of historical work, isn't it? I think that actually there's quite a few examples of buildings that have done this anyway. But that we have, I actually think the GLA headquarters is a very, very good example by Norman Foster. It's a very good example of a building doing precisely the opposite while saying it's doing making a commons. But there are examples of, say, for example, civic buildings that do this already. So you've got this intervention, and this produces a program of activity which necessitates architecture, which you then get to crowdfund for and produce a building off the back of. And then you run into this issue around architectural scalability. Like, how do you actually make a building at this point? And this is where you run into, as you said, the bureaucracy, the regulations, and so on. But this is the later phase of Ostrom's work, isn't it? It's something I mention a lot is her work around co-production. And she has these rules of co-production. Again, I talked to Al Parvin about this, but this idea of a mutuality between institutional and legal power and communities is extremely difficult to negotiate.
No, it is. And I think it's a real shame that, I mean, I am going to write about it, about what the obstacles were at one point. I just need a bit of time to kind of, for it to be finished, and then for me to kind of really analyze it and really think it through. And so I suppose it's that thing that you then go, or is that part of that negotiation? You know, when I said the commons sit as this space between the private and the public, you know, is that kind of, what is that project in a way? So it was really interesting, because when I thought we had more money, and I was calling up to understand if the insulation, what is really ethical kind of insulation. And then I started to talk to the companies, and I said, okay, I can't find you say that this is sustainable. I can't find the report of how it's sustainable. Can you send it to me? So then they sent it to me, and I went through it quite rigorously and realized that actually it's all intention. So they're actually selling something. They're selling an aspiration which isn't really real. And so that just gets perpetuated by then, you know, as an architect, if you don't do that rigorous investigation, you would just go, no, it is sustainable, you know. And so, and then I thought, I said, and then I called them up and I said, so what you're saying is that you hope that this will be sustainable in 5 years' time due to what you're trying to put in production and so on and so on. So it was kind of really interesting in terms of, could we use the commons practice as a way to kind of also address accountability in the two spheres? Because at the moment, that's my other interest, accountability and scrutiny. At the moment, only the public sector could be scrutinized, okay? And the system within which it's scrutinized by itself most of the time. And the private is not scrutinized at all. So this is nuts. I mean, this is just completely nuts. So can the commons, or the institutions within the commons, which is where the public are, where the citizens are, create the systems of scrutiny? And how do you do that with relational ethics of care rather than justice-based ethics? I mean, it's a mega field, you know, like every bit of it, if we're really thinking about systemic change, every bit of it needs to be really considered. It's not just kind of rhetoric coming up with bloody words.
No.
And kind of underdeveloped concepts. So I think that will then have to have impact in the governance bit, in the institutional bits of risk and insurance and, you know, all of those other systems. So that all needs to be redesigned in order for this to happen, you know, in that way. So I think there are, but I think that happens through this, you know, Donald Schoen's reflective practitioner of doing, reflecting, being super critical, and then doing it again. And that's where the theory comes in, because theory is the best way to interrogate what you're doing. So I think, again, it depends. And, you know, there will be people who, and I'm not saying people who are doing commercial architecture, it's up to them if they want to be within that sphere, you know, of the private sector. But if we fully only do that, we just become really extractive as a discipline. We don't have enough to do it in the public sector. Yeah. So, you know, we do need to design different forms of practice. And I think also the other thing, which when you were talking about the communal common good, the resources, there are two different concepts, or philosophical concepts. One, which is more a distinctive common good theory, and a communal common good theory. And the distributive distinctive one is much more ground up, what we decide in smaller, localized, place-based, what is communal common good or communal common interest. And again, the big one, the many, that's the one we all know, because that's the one that actually can be decided from the top down.
Has to be because of its scale again.
Yeah,
it's designed, it's sort of democracy designed to enable top-down power.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we just have to be aware of it, which one we're talking about when, and who has decided that and what. So of course, clean air, yeah, who can disagree with that? But the market being a communal common good, one has to. It's, you know, it's man-made, so we have to question it, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that's where all these nuances come into play.
Yeah, for sure. I know the clean air is, who can argue with that? But I think quite a few people have argued with that for quite a long time to their own financial advantage. I could talk to you about this forever. I think it's really fascinating. So this idea of the commons, we've got this idea of the physical commons, and we've got, and it becomes slightly more ephemeral, slightly more broken up when you start thinking about more ambiguous, less bounded technological social organizations. And we can use architecture, we can use design in the processes of its occupation, use, sharing, production, so on and so forth, to improve or to damage that. But what about this idea of cultural commoning? And you talk about this in your thesis. And this sort of, as I put it in my notes to you beforehand, departs from the spatial idea. So when people think of the commons, if they think of them at all, if they understand them at all, they probably have some kind of socio-spatial idea. But cultural commoning is not social. It's not spatial, sorry. Or is everything spatial? I was arguing this with my wife the other day, actually. That there's only time and space. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I suppose with cultural...
maybe define cultural commoning.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm talking about is really about development, like it's about the context of values and meaning, you know. So if you start to see that within that context, and then what it is that you're producing, what are the values and meanings that they construct and create by you putting that stuff in the world, I think that's what I'm ultimately interested in. And in that sense, it can be spatial, it can be object-based,
Okay.
and so on and so forth. So it's really about how you create a cultural value, cultural norms, cultural symbolism, and all of those things. So that's kind of something I'm super, super interested in terms of, why does something have to look in a particular way, or what is it that, but becoming really quite critical about what it is that we put out there. The problem is, if the only thing that allows you to survive and live is what you put out there, you can't be as critical about it, because you just have to build in order just to survive. So this, I think that's why I think we have to expand practice, and we have to be much more entrepreneurial. I don't have to build to survive, because I just build when I think it's necessary to build, and that is because I can generate my own public art projects with others, with artists and other people. I can be involved in heritage projects. I can be involved in academia. I can be involved in, and actually, I think all of us could have that entity, that kind of being, or at least those of us who want to be within this sphere. So I think, again, that's what I said. I think the important thing is to think what it is that you're laboring for. So that, I think, is really the key thing. So cultural commoning is really about a process of being quite embedded. So my work is always in neighborhoods, whether that's rural or urban. It's always within place. So that's where I am as an architect. I'm always place-based, and that concrete thing of being committed to a place for a long period of time, which is now, like, lots of people talk about it. There's nothing new about it. But at the time when everybody was talking about, in the early 2000s, about place-based architects, it was quite new, because you would just do what the work was. You're still doing it, but. So actually being embedded, the first phase in that cultural commoning is listening. So you have to, and again, in terms of how do you talk to people, I think you don't have to tell them much. You just have to create an environment and a platform for just listening and getting them there. I've seen these kind of around the idea of event and different scale of events as a way to actually do those engagement processes and listening. Then and it does take time, doing community engagement. You can't do it in a month, it really needs quite a lot of time and interest. You have to be interested in it, don't use it as lip service. So again, once you're listening, you start to spatially map out what the cultural values and interests locally are. Then with those mappings, you come back to the office or wherever it is, and you look at all that mapping, you look at power relationships, you look at kind of ethnic, cultural values, you look at whatever they are, locally. And then that's where usually my theoretical bit kicks in, because I think, I don't know enough about this. I don't know what, ethnic diversity and dealing with it means. So I go and read about it, so that really kind of starts to tell me what I should look at. That's why it's so diverse always. So then I use that theory to really think, okay, what would my next move be? And that's kind of this action-centric model of cultural commoning, that then you go back, you then design what the next intervention will be, and then you do that next one, and so on.
That is a response to the values that you've identified on the site.
Response to the place. Yeah, it's not because I think, I am the facilitator within it, and not everybody on the ground wants to do the work that I'm just talking about, but that is what I'm laboring for. And then it's at the end, okay, what's relevant? If it's not a building, it's not a building. Who cares? But it is still spatial, and I think that's where, you know, in our Venice, which is still up actually, in the
Go on, give it a plug. Give it a plug.
Yes, in the building centre in Store Street. But the massive banner, the situated image that we developed, Andreas and I initially developed when we were teaching together, was really about how then a lot of this stuff that are quite invisible and ephemeral come together, because we spent ages, you know, we were talking about the stuff I'm talking to you, and then we had like people sitting around drinking coffee, you know, or having a, you know, having a meal, and that didn't really convey all the richness, the narratives, the symbolisms, the meaning, the values. So the situated image then became, or the situated drawing in a way, became a performative kind of image that is a lot of production. But, you know, there are props in it, there are bits of buildings in it, the communities are in it, you know, there are drawings in it, there are images in it. So it's a very visual manifestation of that cultural commoning. So in a way, we had to come up with this, and we came up with it looking at actually, you know, 16th, 17th century paintings with symbolisms. But those symbolisms were very clear because they were religious or they were whatever cultural to the people of the time. Now we have to decipher it. And these are the symbolisms that come from the ground. And not everybody is maybe familiar with it, but you know, the residents who've been part of it are familiar with it. But then if you do a guide, then others become familiar with it, you know, and there might be things which are around how, you know, a community garden was initiated and how it survived. You know, it might be about acts of, you know, activist acts over, you know, protecting an adventure playground, or, you know, so there could be many narratives that have been part of those processes. But then,
I mean, to give it a name, though, you're talking about the Ministry of Common Land at the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale.
Yes.
In 2021.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That was the plug I was hoping for.
Sorry, I'm very bad at plugging.
And which is now on in the building centre in central London.
Yes, and it's there until end of September. And actually, we are going to have, I am going to be running a citizens' assembly on the 10th of September, using the situated drawing as a base. And we're going to do a parade from the Store Street, from the building centre to Bedford Square in front of the Architectural Association. On the 24th of September, and the 12th to the 19th, we're going to be running a school, which is the Commons and the Metaverse.
Go large or go home. That's There you go. Now I think that's a legitimate plug, because it's impressive to do the Venice Biennale, if you don't mind, though I say so myself. But I interrupted you. So this idea of creating a cultural commons, I think, is really elegant, of producing reflexively, iteratively, as a designer, working again in that way that you talked about, as a kind of fulcrum between public, individual, enterprise, state, third sector, community, grassroots. And you, in a very anthropological way, to begin with, listen and watch, and then you act, and then you watch what happens with the act, and then you go back in and you act again,
you analyze, critically analyze, and then you go back act again. And the reason I was interested in this cultural commoning as values was that for years we would and we saw the decline of this, that for years we would be in communities, in neighborhoods, and there would be a real apathy, and there would be a real problem of getting people engaged, mainly because they were going shopping, you know. And so and actually, because I was really interested, so I was like, but what are you shopping? Food? And they were like, no, because I get those online. I'm just going shopping. Mm-hmm. So then I started to think, wow, I mean, this kind of capitalist value system that Adam Curtis in his Century of Self and then Hypernormalization really beautifully sets out. And I think anybody who probably listens to this should also go and see that. It's on YouTube. Is that all of those, it's a propaganda, the advertising and those plethora of visuals that are out there. And it's not just a capitalist propaganda. I mean, that's how propaganda has operated. The communists did it with the agitational propaganda trains and so on and so forth. So we do have to be really careful about it, but we have to also understand the context within which the masses their values are being influenced. So then you want to really get into the grain of unpacking that a little bit and seeing, well, is that socialized value, or do they really, it's really difficult to untangle. But in a way, if we have the new cultural commons, then maybe we can at least have a platform to democratically deliberate and discuss this without this kind of top-down kind of imposition. I mean, I generally also think that kind of that happens with taste as well. It happens with all of these things. And I think a lot of people listening will probably go, "Oh my God, that's just so much work," to untangle all of that. But then I think, yeah, that's fine. But then don't pretend that that's what you're doing, because that's where the problem happens, because nothing changes, because the rhetoric is right. But actually the effort is not there. And then we go, but we've tried all this, but because we've been doing it for ages. And then it doesn't work. So I think it just really, and that's why I did the course, so that you really learn how to do this in a really, really rigorous way. Because I just felt like it was impossible to just do it. For everything you need training, right? So I think that for me, that's the really important thing, and especially with really scary planetary issues, we really can't be complicit and we can't be complacent. No. We do have to think about different forms of practice.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not doing very well. I mean, this is one of Al Parvin's points from a TED talk, because you did a lovely TED talk, and I'll link to that in the description of this podcast. But Al Parvin did one. Yes. I mean, he came and gave a talk at the Glasgow School of Art where I was before, and as he pointed out, it's just a really bad business model.
Yeah. I
mean, designing for an incredibly small niche of people.
Yeah.
It's just a crappy business model, which means that there's this fight to the bottom in terms of fees. Architects are disrespected. No one really gives a monkeys about what we do. Yeah. Except for the razzmatazzy ones at the top who don't produce buildings that are particularly meaningful. Truth be told, then I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
They're exclusively professionalized esoteric design thinking. Anyway, I could rant about that till the cows come home. But I really like this. I think this is a really strong idea, and I fully agree with you. And I think many people would agree with you that something major needs to happen in the way that architecture as practice performs, because it's not doing any good at the moment. And I've mentioned again on this podcast, I mentioned a scholar from UC Berkeley, Dana Cuff, I think she's at UC Berkeley, talking about the way that architectural practice, particularly radical practice, is utilized by the center, by the cultural center, that is to say the mainstream, the RIBA / high-techy, established voices, kind of modernist stuff. They use the kind of radical practitioner as a way of consolidating their own hegemonic power.
Yeah.
So they actually literally employ them. And I've done projects for much larger companies where we're the foot soldiers of their community engagement. And then they get to just smash down massive buildings.
Yeah.
And they get to kind of social wash their projects. And if they don't like what you say, they fire you.
Yeah.
And you don't get your fee, which has also happened. And I think that I think we need to entirely reimagine how we do practice around these core issues, because, I mean, set aside climate, we've also got the fact that the urban doesn't work very well for poor people. I mean, London isn't affordable. Increasingly, I live in Margate in Kent, and in the last 3-4 years, house prices have probably doubled.
Yeah.
I mean, what are they doing with all the poor people? It's not like all the poor people are going around in Rolls Royces now and cashing out. It's that they've been marginalized, or they've been shunted into smaller spaces. So something has to be done. You're absolutely right. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about, and was this idea of what I put it, materializing common practices. How do you as a practitioner and as an educator describe this? How do we evidence this type of practice? Because it's obviously different from mainstream practice, where, a client comes to you, you do the site visit, you produce the briefing documents, you produce the design documents or pre-design documents, and so on and so forth. There's a series of things that are purchased, and most of it is post-contract, post design. But it's a product. It's definitely a packageable product. You could draw a line around it. You can put it in an envelope.
Yeah.
What does this look like? And then how do you teach this?
Yeah. So, it's interesting that, we're 20 years old as a practice, and we have never been approached by the AJ, by any of these but it's kind of interesting.
What, not even after the Venice Biennale?
No, like none of them. They do not recognize what we do as relevant enough in the field of architecture. Obviously, or they're very lazy. So it's not that I want to be there, to be honest.
No.
But I think it's more that how do you start to rethink? How do you start to embrace unfamiliarity? I think this is the confidence of digging a bit deeper to understand the ramification of what isn't instantly familiar is really important. And I think there's a lot of slightly lazy kind of journalism that reproduces the familiar. And I think that, for me, is really, really problematic. And I'm not just saying about my practice. There are also other really interesting kind of emerging practices that probably who are architects, but don't really occupy this architectural context, so people don't even know them. And so then I think, in a way, that's one thing. I think it's really important. Then it's more about actually starting to look at practice as the creative aesthetic project. And so once you start to look at practice within...
You've gone silent. Torange, you've gone completely silent.
Hello?
Oh, you're back. Say that again, because that was a...
Yeah, so if you start to see practice as an aesthetic and as an aesthetic project, then, and a creative project, then you start to shift things, because and actually embrace that it's unfamiliar. The thing is, I think a lot of architects, and I might be generalizing, and I apologize if I am, but I think a lot of architects produce stuff to be published. They don't, that's the intention, or to have money, so I think they also, so it's like this feeding system. So then they think, oh, well, if I do an alternative practice, where do I get published? Who are the people who are going to give me the awards, and so on and so forth. And so I think that needs a movement in a way, to start to look at practice as an aesthetic thing. It needs its own probably awards and blah blah blah. And then it's, I mean, in a way, it's really important that if you are constructing the commons, and the commons are about really critically looking at vertical power exertions, extraction, enclosure of land, if it's really trying to critique all of these social ethical stuff, you cannot have a practice that is unethical. You cannot have a practice that you are terrible to your staff.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have those kind of hierarchical positions. So in a way, in public works, and maybe that's a kind of good thing to describe, we are a commons in a way. Although Andreas and I are the remaining co-founders of public works, we are all directors, and we are 12, I think. God, it might be 10, I can't remember now. But the way that it works is that we kind of collaborate with really interesting people who want to collaborate with us. A lot of the time they're our ex-students. They were our ex-students, but now it's changing because they're now having their network and so on. But they're all, we kind of supported them for a period of time. And we said, the resource here is the Public Works Archive. Mm-hmm. So you can use that as you want to generate your own interest, your own clients, your own projects. We have to all put in 20% into a collective pot from what we generate. But everybody is in control of their own labor. They can, they can't suddenly cost the daily rate in crazy amounts, but they can budget it. They can take whatever holidays they want. So it's completely up to them, and we make decisions all together about what to do with that kind of 20%, or what to do about the practice, and that 20% also pays for the overheads. So then what we do, we collaborate rather than grow more than we need to in order to have democratic decision making. We collaborate with smaller practices to be supportive again, to do projects together rather than just accumulate everybody into our own enclosure. Yeah. So then again, that's that permeability of the boundary. We do have some people who we have employed because we've got funding for certain projects, but that they're kind of time limited, and they're anyway developing their own practice outside that kind of employment. So I think that's kind of, in a way, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we do need to think about that. You have to be authentic throughout the way you treat your students. You can't be master student and talk about care, know. So I think all of that needs to be embedded into an authenticity. And I even know there are a lot of cooperatives I am aware of who behave really badly to their other. So that's why I'm really interested in the beautiful organization.
Yeah. I think this is a really elegant idea. The aesthetics of practice as an aesthetic enterprise is a really, really profound one. I think that's a lovely point to finish on, but I just wanted to sort of maybe just one last go over this idea of moving, if what we have in practice at the moment in mainstream practice is a hierarchical relationship where the client sits the money, and you talked about social housing organizations, for example, beforehand, who have been converted by the joys of neoliberalism into another component of neoliberalism, let's be honest. And a lot of third sector organizations have, where the architect sits almost as the servant of hegemonic power and money, and applies that logic, is the tool by which that that sort of diamond tip of the pickaxe
Yeah.
of capitalism, neoliberalism, is applied to communities to give them what they want, which is really not what they want, but what they should have, which is shopping.
What they should want.
Which is shopping.
The market is a common good.
Yeah. And your approach is about, well, it's nothing to do with that in a way, isn't it? It's got nothing to do with that logic at all. It's about building, as you described it, a community of care, a community of relationships.
It's really about what do they actually really want and need, and and how, we talk about mental health. Mental health is not something that is like sits outside you. Mental health is something which is a symptom of the way we are treated on a day-to-day basis, the precarity we feel, the disempowerment we feel, and all of that. And actually the architects are so disempowered. It's, I did this power mapping in one project, and the architects were the most disempowered. Yet they have the image of being in power by the community. So they get all the shit from the community as well. But actually they are the least empowered. Yeah. So actually, it's an idiotic thing not to change the practice in which you are so disempowered. Yeah. So in order to do what? We're not even building the most beautiful buildings. I'm really sorry. I walk around London and I don't know where I am. They all cookie cutter, like they all look the same. I don't want to design this. It's not. It's not even like, what are you doing it for? Like, has anybody asked, what are you doing this for? And so is it to say, I have a practice that are 300 people? Who cares? What are you doing? So I think that's the other problem. The other problem is that value is given to your size, and it's not given to your impact. It's not given to what it is that you're actually achieving that is good for society. So then that's why they have to use the rhetoric of we need more homes. There was a fantastic architect actually in a conference recently, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. And he did this incredibly rigorous research and talk around the fact that we don't need more housing. It's to do with the economy. It's got nothing to do with housing. Yet I have commercial architects in panel discussions saying we need more housing. I have my neighbors saying that, because it is being put out there as this kind of propaganda that, and we do need really, really cheap housing, but we don't need this housing that is being produced and claimed as affordable. So I think there are all these kind of issues, and there's a certain disempowerment in how do you create new economic systems. That's where 0-0 are very good at that stuff actually, and I really do have a lot of time for them. And we do a lot together, and I think beyond them, why should they be the only ones who are thinking about that? Beyond them, what are the economic models? We have blockchain technology, for God's sake. We have decentralized finance now coming up. We're still thinking like the Egyptians thought about the practice. I'm not joking. I did a history of architectural practice for first-year architecture students from Egyptian time up to 19th century. And nothing has changed, not much, And so you kind of think, isn't this a lost opportunity? Like, what is this? And I think, and I won't name names, but even those who start really interestingly as practices end up being extremely conventional.
I know who you're talking about. I'm not going to say their name. But I would say someone like Rem. Rem did it.
Yeah.
And Coop Himmelblau did it. They were amazing.
Yeah.
And they still are amazing. But they are not what they say they are.
No. And I think that's the thing. To remain authentic, you need to continuously be rethinking practice. Continuously. not so much form, but yes, form of the practice. If you think about aesthetic as it has a structure, so that's aesthetic property. I mean, this is what aesthetic theory is. You have aesthetic property, which is the structure of that thing. You have aesthetic attitude, which is the intention and the ideas of the thing. And you have aesthetic experience, which is how one in contact to that you feel, whatever that might be. I mean, just taking that simplistic frame for aesthetic, it's already, to frame practice through that, you're already talking about form, you're already talking about concept and attitude, and you're talking about its experience and users, and those who are part of it, those who come in contact with it, and those who are in it. And so in a way, these become really rich domains within which to do that. And the problem is, and I don't have even enough time to do it within our own practice, is that you need resourcing in order to have the time to design this. Because at the moment, I think it should be one of the stages of the RIBA. And I think that the clients need to pay for that. That needs to be part of the stages as part of social good or whatever it might be. That should be in there.
Yeah. As part of our, one part of our professional responsibility,
yes,
is to work for the common good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually, I can't quite remember what the phrase is, but the professional, like the architect or the vet or the doctor.
Our code of conduct.
Part of what defines us is that we're doing stuff for the common good. And then, you go past that stuff near Battersea Power Station, as you come up on the train towards Victoria Station over the river. It's possibly the ugliest thing in the history of the world. It makes Pyongyang look like a kind of Butlins. It's just astoundingly ugly. What planet is that acceptable? So yeah, I could rant about that for a long time, as you can probably tell.
Me too. Well, I just think it's not architecture, it's real estate.
It's not architecture, is it?
It's real estate and architecture by Excel.
So what does maybe really quickly, there is hope for the future and it's going to be good.
Yes. I always think there's hope, and I always, anything that starts to disempower me or my students or, people around us, I always think, okay, so what are the obstacles?
Yeah.
What are the obstacles? How do you overcome it?
Yeah.
And we really need to think about that. And I think there has to be allowance for diversity as well within the profession. I never think there should be one model. And Alistair, we did one thing together, and Alistair said, I would hate a world where everything was commons. And I said, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
It has to allow for diversity of spheres for us to operate. But at the moment, I think all of it is in one, and that's detrimental to everything. That's where systems collapse, when you have parasitic dominance, and I think that's what we're in at the moment.
What a point to finish on. Thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you so much. It was really enjoyable.
And so it goes. Thank you to Dr. Torange for joining me and sharing her considerable knowledge and expertise on the podcast. It was thoroughly interesting, entertaining and insightful, I think you'll agree, and seems to be a perfect foundation for this year's conversations. Architecture as social science, at once poetic and robust. Please follow the links in the podcast description for more from Torange, including interviews and her professional profiles. And if you don't already, of course, subscribe to Ears for Architecture and then listen to it, like it and share it all about. Cheers.